Welcome. I want you to cast aside the story you think you know. Forget the whimsical tale of a clever girl and her button-eyed adventure, a charming stop-motion fable for a dark afternoon. That version is a comfortable blanket thrown over a cold, hard grave. The truth is not a fairy tale. It is a case study in predation, a clinical observation of how a soul is meticulously disassembled. There is no charming magic in this story, only the cold, calculated mechanics of a trap. This is not the story of a girl who found another world, but of a girl who was targeted, groomed, and nearly consumed by a hunger that wears a mother's face. What you are about to hear is the blueprint of that hunger, a glimpse into the web where love is the bait and a child's loneliness is the perfect, helpless prey. Her name was Coraline Jones, and she was a ghost in her own home, a phantom drifting through rooms where her parents sat like statues, their faces illuminated by the pale, cold light of computer screens. Her defining feature was not her blue hair or her yellow raincoat, but a profound and cavernous loneliness, an ache so deep it felt like a physical part of her. This was her great vulnerability, an open wound weeping a constant silent plea to be seen, to be valued, to be held. Her need for affection was not a simple childhood wish. It was a pathological craving, a desperate thirst in an emotional desert. The beldam, an entity ancient and patient, could smell this kind of thirst from a dimension away, recognizing it as the sweetest perfume, the most irresistible invitation to begin its work. The Pink Palace Apartments was not a home. It was a tombstone for forgotten things, perpetually shrouded in a cold, weeping Oregon fog. The air inside tasted of damp plaster and the sweet, cloying scent of decay that clung to the floral wallpaper like a second skin. Every floorboard groaned with a weary complaint. Every gust of wind through the ill-fitting window frames sounded like a thin, sorrowful whisper. The silence in the house was a living thing, broken only by the incessant dripping of water somewhere in the walls and the distant, monotonous clicking of her parents' keyboards. It was a place that amplified her isolation, a sprawling, empty stage for her neglect, where the peeling paint and faded carpets were a mirror for the slow erosion of her own spirit, a constant, oppressive reminder of her own invisibility. The lure did not present itself as a mouse, but as something far more insidious. It was a skittering, disjointed thing made of shadow and compacted dust, a disembodied hand that moved with the unnerving, arachnid grace of a hunting spider. Coraline, starved for any distraction from the suffocating gray of her life, followed it, not with curiosity, but with a kind of desperate compulsion. It led her to the drawing room, a place of unused furniture shrouded in white sheets like corpses, and to a small, forgotten door set low in the wall. The sight of it sparked the first flicker of something other than despair she had felt in weeks. It was a secret, a diversion, a potential escape route from the crushing weight of her reality, and the sight of its sealed, papered-over surface felt less like a barrier and more like a promise. That night, the house settled into its usual deep, unfeeling quiet, but Coraline could not sleep. The gnawing ache in her chest, the desperate wish for a world that was not this one, propelled her from her bed. Drawn by an instinct she didn't understand, she returned to the small door. The wallpaper was gone. A cold draft, smelling of rich soil and an impossible sugary perfume, emanated from its keyhole. She turned the key, and the door swung open, not onto a wall of bricks, but into a tunnel that pulsed with a soft, bioluminescent light. It was a tube of slick, dark membrane, ribbed and wet, like the throat of some impossible beast. A sane child would have recoiled in terror, but Coraline was not sane. She was starving, and with a breath held tight in her lungs, she made the transgression, crawling into the warm, breathing darkness, trading a world that ignored her for a lie that promised everything. She emerged into a mirror of her own kitchen, yet it was a reflection perfected, polished to an impossible sheen. The air, thick and warm, smelled of roasting chicken and freshly baked chocolate cake. Scents so potent and comforting, they felt like a physical embrace. Here, the colors were alive, the drabness of her world replaced with vibrant cherry reds and deep, welcoming ochres. And there, at the stove, was her mother. Not her real mother, whose posture was a permanent question mark over a keyboard, but a woman whose smile was a beacon, whose eyes, black, shiny buttons, seemed to see right into the hollow space in Coraline's chest. The performance was flawless, a symphony of maternal affection composed specifically for an audience of one profoundly lonely child, and Coraline, despite a primal shiver of wrongness, found herself giving a standing ovation in her heart. "You're just in time for supper, darling," the woman cooed, her voice a perfect echo of her mother's, but laced with a honeyed warmth that was utterly alien. Every word was a carefully crafted lure. The other mother served a feast that seemed pulled from Coraline's most secret daydreams, a golden brown chicken that steamed with savory promises, gravy as rich as melted velvet, and a cake so dark and moist it seemed to absorb the light. Coraline ate with a ravenous hunger that was more emotional than physical, devouring not just the food, but the attention, the focused, unwavering affection radiating from this button-eyed woman. For the first time, she was the center of a universe, the sole object of a parent's delight, and the sheer, overwhelming power of that sensation was a potent anesthetic against the deep, instinctual warnings that screamed just beneath the surface of her mind. The other father sat at the table, his smile as wide and welcoming as his wife's. He was a caricature of paternal engagement, leaning in to listen to Coraline's every word, his button eyes gleaming with feigned interest. He spoke of the magnificent, magical garden he had created just for her, of a world where the mud was never messy and the flowers sang her name. It was all too perfect, a meticulously constructed fantasy. Coraline noticed the way his fingers, unnaturally nimble, never quite seemed to touch his fork, how his head tilted at an angle that was just slightly too sharp, too puppet-like. A small, cold knot of dread began to tighten in her stomach, a dissonance between the perfect fantasy being presented and the grotesque, unseen machinery she could feel grinding away just behind the painted scenery. Later, in the other bedroom, the toys were a marvel of dark imagination. There was a wind-up dragonfly that zipped through the air with wings of stained glass, and a toy box that seemed to contain an entire living circus in miniature. But as Coraline reached for a beautifully crafted doll that looked just like her, she felt the chill of its porcelain skin and saw its own black button eyes. It was a replica, a trophy. The room, for all its wonders, felt like a cage being decorated, the bars being prettied up before the lock was turned. The beldam was not giving her gifts. She was showing Coraline what she could possess, what she could become. Each toy was a hook, each marvel a silken thread in the growing web, designed to ensnare her will. The days in the other world bled into a perfect repetitive cycle of feigned love and bespoke wonders. The beldam's performance was masterful, anticipating Coraline's every whim, soothing every buried insecurity with a perfectly timed word or a tender gesture. Her long, thin fingers, tipped in sharp black nails, would stroke Coraline's hair, and the touch was both comforting and terrifyingly cold, like the caress of a beautiful, patient insect. Coraline found her own memories of her real parents beginning to fade, their faces growing pale and indistinct, replaced by these vibrant, attentive impostors. She was being indoctrinated, her loyalties systematically transferred, her own reality gaslit into a gray, undesirable memory she was being taught to despise. The poison was working not with a sudden shock, but as a slow, sweet-acting sedative. The rot beneath the perfection began to show in the smallest of fissures. The black cat, astray from her own world, would appear in this place, its green eyes glowing with an ancient intelligence. It spoke to her here, its voice a dry, cynical rasp, warning her that the beldam did not create, only twisted and stole. Coraline would see things at the edge of her vision, a patch of wallpaper momentarily peeling back to reveal a writhing organic darkness beneath, or the other mother's smile momentarily stretching too wide, revealing not teeth, but a row of needle-sharp points. These glimpses of the truth were fleeting, easily dismissed as dreams or tricks of the light, but they were planting seeds of paranoia that were beginning to sprout in the fertile ground of her anxiety. The first true schism in the fantasy occurred with the other father. The beldam, in a grand gesture of her power, commanded him to write a song for Coraline and perform it on the grand piano in the drawing room. He sat down, his gloved hands poised over the keys, and began to play a beautiful, melancholic melody. The tune was enchanting, a lullaby of sweet promises, and for a moment Coraline allowed herself to be swept away, to believe in the beautiful lie completely. The music was a testament to his love for her, a love she had craved her entire life. This, she thought, this must be real. This feeling, this moment of pure artistic connection, could not possibly be a fabrication. Then, halfway through the performance, the music began to stutter. The other father's hands, which had been moving with such fluid grace, suddenly seized. Coraline watched in horror as his fingers began to fight against his own volition, the gloves straining at the seams. The beldam's control was faltering, her puppetry becoming clumsy and violent. The other father's hands contorted, breaking their own fabricated digits with audible snaps of wood and plaster to force the melody to continue. He was a prisoner inside his own body, his hands acting as both the instrument and the tortured musician, forced to destroy himself for the sake of the performance, a grotesque parody of artistic devotion. His painted smile remained fixed, a rictus of cheerful compliance that was horribly at odds with the violent struggle of his limbs. But from one of his black button eyes, a single thick tear of black ooze began to well up and drip slowly down his cheek. It was a tear of ink, of dust, of sorrow, a viscous drop of pure despair. In that single, silent tear, Coraline saw the absolute truth. He was not a person. He was a thing, a hollowed-out husk made of dough and sawdust, and the lingering, weeping memory of a father who had been consumed long ago. The man at the piano was just a costume, and the creature wearing it was in unimaginable, eternal pain. The music finally collapsed into a discordant crash of keys, and the other father slumped over the piano, his hands mangled and still. The illusion was not just cracked, it had been violently shattered. The beautiful room now seemed like a charnel house, the cheerful colors garish and mocking. Coraline looked at the beldam, whose own smile had tightened into a thin, sharp line of irritation at the flawed performance. The warmth in her button eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, possessive hunger. The mask had slipped, and for the first time, Coraline saw the monster beneath. The terror that flooded her was no longer a subtle unease. It was a physical force, an icy wave that threatened to drown her. The offer came soon after, the inevitable demand. The beldam presented her with a small velvet-lined box. Inside, nestled on the dark fabric, were a needle, a spool of black thread, and 2 large, shiny black buttons. "So you can stay forever?" she purred, the sound no longer comforting but menacing, a dry, clicking sound now clearly audible beneath the words. The button seemed to drink the light from the room, cold and dead as a spider's eyes. The demand was obscene, to surrender her sight, to be blinded to reality and see only the world the beldam permitted, to have her soul sealed away behind these polished black stones. It was the final stage of consumption, the moment of ultimate possession. Coraline's refusal was not a shout, but a choked, terrified whisper. "No!" The word hung in the air, and the entire other world seemed to freeze, the beldam's face contorted, the pleasant maternal mask melting away into a visage of pure predatory rage. Her neck elongated, her head tilting at an impossible angle as she shrieked, a sound of tearing fabric and scraping metal. The walls of the house began to decay before Coraline's eyes, the vibrant colors bleeding away to a sickly monochrome gray. The beautiful furniture twisted into skeletal broken shapes. It was time to run. She turned and fled, a raw animal panic propelling her feet as the world unraveled into nightmare around her. She scrambled back towards the pulsating tunnel, the only escape route, which now seemed less like a throat and more like a convulsing, dying artery. The beldam's enraged screams echoed behind her, promising eternal torment. Coraline crawled frantically through the collapsing passage, the slick walls now cold and ragged, clawing at her clothes. She burst back through the small door into her own drawing room, slamming it shut behind her and collapsing onto the dusty floor, her body trembling uncontrollably. For a moment, there was only the sound of her own ragged, desperate gasps for air. She was home. The familiar smell of dust and damp, once oppressive, was now the sweet scent of safety, the perfume of reality. The relief was a powerful, intoxicating wave. She had escaped. The nightmare was over. She lay on the floor, the solid, real wood beneath her a comforting anchor. The silence of her house, once a symbol of her loneliness, now felt like a shield, a blessed peace. She staggered to her feet, a shaky laugh escaping her lips. It had been a dream, a horrible, vivid hallucination brought on by her unhappiness. That was all. Her parents would be in their study, oblivious, and she would never, ever open that little door again. She clung to this explanation like a life raft, a desperate piece of psychological driftwood in the storm that had just passed. The ordeal was finished. She was safe. But the silence was too deep, too absolute. The usual distant clicking of keyboards was absent. A new kind of cold, one that had nothing to do with the Oregon weather, began to seep into the room, creeping up from the floorboards and raising the hairs on her arms. "Mom? Dad?" she called out, her voice small and thin in the oppressive stillness. There was no answer. She walked through the house, her initial relief curdling into a new, sharper form of dread. Every room was empty, still and cold, as if no one had lived there for years. Her parents' studies were deserted, their computers dark, their chairs pushed neatly under their desks. They were gone, simply, utterly gone. A flicker of movement in the hallway mirror caught her eye. She turned, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. There, on the other side of the glass, was a reflection of her own hallway, but it was darker, misted over as if in a deep frost. And in that reflected hallway stood her parents. Their faces were pale with an unearthly terror, their mouths open in silent screams. They weren't a reflection, they were prisoners. Her real mother and father were trapped inside the mirror, pounding frantically against the glass, their knuckles making no sound. Their eyes were wide with a horror that was directed at something behind them. In the darkness of their glass prison, Coraline pressed her hand to the mirror's surface. It was ice cold. On the other side, her mother pressed her own hand against the glass to meet hers, a desperate, silent plea for contact. Her cold breath fogged the surface from within, and with a trembling finger, she traced 2 words in the condensation: "Help us." The letters hung there for a heartbeat, a ghostly message from a world she could not reach, the fragile hope that her home was a sanctuary, that her escape had been successful, was not just broken, it was annihilated. The beldam's web was not confined to the other world. It had already stretched through the mirror, through reality itself, and had snatched away the very people whose neglect had driven her into the trap. Before Coraline could even scream, a long, needle-thin limb, black and chitinous like a spider's leg, shot out from the darkness behind her parents in the mirror. It wrapped around her mother's waist, impossibly strong, and began to drag her and her father back into the suffocating blackness. Their silent screams intensified, their fingers scraping uselessly against the glass as they were pulled away from the surface, their terrified faces shrinking into the depths of the mirror until they were swallowed completely by the void. The fog on the glass faded, the message vanished, and Coraline was left staring at her own horrified reflection in the cold, empty hallway. The trap hadn't just been reset. It had expanded to consume everything she had. Forced to return to bargain with the monster for the lives of her parents, Coraline re-entered the other world. It was no longer a welcoming paradise. It was an explicit ruin, a gray, decaying mockery of her home. The beldam, furious at her defiance, set her a new task: to find the souls of the ghost children she had consumed, victims who had come before Coraline. The final soul, she was told, was hidden in the darkest place of all, the cellar. With the black cat as her only guide, Coraline descended the rickety wooden stairs, each step groaning under her weight, into a darkness that felt thick and suffocating, smelling of wet earth, rotting potatoes, and something else. Something like spoiled sweetness and sawdust. The cellar was a labyrinth of forgotten things, a graveyard of the beldam's broken toys and failed creations. A damp, earthen floor squelched under Coraline's feet. In the single weak beam of her flashlight, she saw shapes that writhed and pulsed, half-formed things made of cobwebs and dirt that scurried away from the light. The air was heavy with despair, the psychic residue of all the children who had been trapped and dismantled in this place. This was the beldam's workshop, her pantry, the place where she unmade her victims. Every shadow seemed to hold a watching presence. Every drip of water sounded like a weeping child. Coraline felt her sanity fraying, the edges becoming thin and transparent. And then she saw him, pinned to the damp stone wall by what looked like oversized sewing needles, was the other Wybie. He was no longer the cheerful, if slightly pathetic boy from her earlier visits. His mouth, once set in a permanent painted grin, had been crudely sewn shut with thick, coarse black thread. The stitches, angry and tight. He hung there like a discarded marionette, his head slumped to one side, his button eyes wide and staring, but utterly vacant. He had tried to help her, to warn her, and this was his punishment. This was the beldam's response to disobedience, a clear and brutal message intended just for her. He was still conscious, still aware. As Coraline's light fell upon him, a faint, shuddering tremor ran through his sawdust-stuffed body. His one free hand, made of stained cotton, twitched feebly, a silent, desperate plea. This was the beldam's true artistry, not just destruction, but prolonged, agonizing erasure. She was unmaking him, slowly and deliberately, as a lesson for Coraline. The sawdust that was his lifeblood was leaking from a gash in his side, forming a pathetic, damp pile on the earthen floor. He was dissolving, his form losing its integrity, his existence literally trickling away into the dirt of the cellar floor. Coraline was forced to watch, frozen in a paralysis of horror and guilt. She couldn't look away. The beldam wanted her to bear witness to this final, obscene degradation. She saw the light in his button eyes flicker and dim as the last of his fabricated life force drained away. He made no sound as he sagged, his form deflating, the empty sack of his body slumping against the wall before sliding down into a heap of damp cloth and dust. He was gone, erased. It was a visceral promise of what happened to the beldam's toys when she grew tired of them, and a graphic, terrifying preview of what awaited Coraline's own soul if she failed. The sight broke something deep inside her, the last vestiges of childhood innocence, the naive belief that courage and goodness could somehow win the day, were scoured away by the raw, brutal reality of this place. This was not a game with rules that could be won. It was a hunt, and she was the prey. The other Wybe's silent, agonizing end was not just a threat, it was a revelation of the nature of her enemy. The beldam was not a monster of simple malice. She was an artist of despair, a sculptor of psychological torment, and her medium was the slow, agonizing destruction of hope itself. There, in the pile of damp rags that had once been the other Wybe, Coraline saw it, a small, glowing marble, the final soul of a lost child. She reached for it, her hand trembling, the cold glass a stark contrast to the lingering horror of the scene. She had what she needed to challenge the beast, but the cost of this knowledge was a piece of her own soul. The girl who had entered the cellar, scared but still hopeful, did not exist anymore. The one who ascended the stairs held the soul in her hand, but her own heart was now a cold, hard stone in her chest, weighed down by the terrible, absolute certainty of the evil she was about to face. Ascending from the cellar, Coraline was no longer a child playing a game. She was a soldier returning from a bloody trench, bearing the dog tags of the fallen. She clutched the three souls, small marbles that pulsed with a faint, sorrowful light, their cold weight a grim comfort in her palm. She found the beldam waiting in the drawing-room, seated in an armchair, tapping one of her long, needle-like fingers against a small snow globe on the table beside her. Inside the globe, minuscule and terrified, were her parents, clinging to each other as a swirl of artificial snow fell around them. The beldam's button eyes gleamed with smug satisfaction. She had all the pieces, and the board was hers to command. The time for seduction was over. Now was the time for the final cruel transaction. "Clever girl!" the beldam hissed, the sound dry as locust wings. "You found my little lost things. But you've forgotten the grand prize. She gestured to the snow globe with a flourish. Your parents. Shall we play one more game for them? A finding game. You guess where they are hidden. If you win, you, your tedious parents, and these little souls can all go free. But if you lose, she let the threat hang in the air, smiling as she held up the needle and black thread. The wager was simple. Their freedom against her eternal servitude, her sight, her very soul. Coraline, feeling the faint, desperate whispers of the ghost children urging her on, had no choice but to accept the rigged game. The moment she agreed, the room began to dissolve. The illusion of home, already decayed, now fractured completely. The floorboards tore apart, revealing not dirt and foundation, but a vast, gaping abyss, across which the entire room was suspended in a colossal, shimmering spider's web. The floral wallpaper peeled back to reveal walls of chittering, twitching insect parts and weeping black ichor. The furniture elongated and twisted, the legs of the armchair becoming spindly, sharpened insect limbs. This was not a twisted version of her house anymore. This was the beldam's nest, the true reality of her parasitic dimension, a surgically constructed nightmare of silk and bone and stolen memories. Coraline stood at its center, a fly who had just realized the parlor was a trap. Coraline's heart hammered against her ribs, but the cold, hard certainty that had formed in the cellar kept her from screaming. She had to think, not feel. The game was a lie, another performance. The beldam was a creature of ego, a predator that delighted in its own cleverness. With the cat, a silent shadow ally now at her side, and the seeing stone from the ghost children, she looked for a trick, a weakness in the monster's hubris. She realized the game wasn't about finding her parents. It was about fooling the beldam into revealing them. Her eyes fixed on the snow globe, sitting so obviously on the table. The trap was to assume it was a trick, to search the horrifying landscape for some other, more cleverly hidden prison. "They're in the passageway," Coraline said, her voice trembling but firm, pointing toward the small door. Behind the door. It was a gamble, a piece of theater to play on the beldam's arrogance. A slow, cruel smile spread across the beldam's face. She was delighted. The child had fallen for the misdirection, guessed wrong, and sealed her own fate. "You think I'd make it so easy?" she sneered, her voice dripping with contemptuous victory. She picked up the snow globe and shook it mockingly. "They're right here, you foolish little thing, right where you couldn't see them." In her gloating, in her need to prove her own superiority, she had confirmed it. She had lost her own game. The beldam's moment of triumph was Coraline's only chance. "No," Coraline said, and with a surge of adrenaline, she threw the black cat directly at the monster's face. The cat, an extension of the real world's untamable nature, latched on with claws and teeth, eliciting a shriek of rage and pain from the beldam. In that single moment of distraction, Coraline lunged, her fingers closing around the cold glass of the snow globe. She had her parents. She had the souls. Now, she just had to survive the rage of a god in its own collapsing hell. The beldam tore the cat from her face, her features beginning to melt and stretch, the human mask burning away. The transformation was an obscenity of nature. The beldam's skin split down the middle, peeling back like old parchment to reveal a gleaming black exoskeleton beneath. Her limbs cracked and reformed, elongating into impossibly long, needle-sharp spider legs. Her torso rose from the tatters of the other mother disguise, a skeletal insectoid horror of mismatched parts and sharp angles, towering toward the web-covered ceiling. The button eyes fell away, revealing dozens of small, red, predatory eyes that all fixed on Coraline with an ancient, soul-freezing hatred. The comforting voice was replaced by a high-pitched, chittering shriek that vibrated through the very threads of the web, a sound of pure cosmic malice. With her true form revealed, the world gave way to her rage. The web beneath Coraline's feet began to tear and dissolve into nothingness. She ran, scrambled, her feet finding purchase on strands of sticky silk just as they snapped behind her. The beldam, a towering nightmare of clicking bone, pursued her, her spidery legs striking down like daggers, narrowly missing Coraline and shattering the fragile reality with every impact. The drawing room, the web, the entire pocket dimension was imploding, collapsing into a chaotic vortex of darkness and shrieking winds, all of it trying to pull her down into the abyss with its dying queen. The escape was a frantic, desperate scrabble for the light. She reached the pulsating tunnel just as the world behind her dissolved completely. She threw herself into the passage, which was no longer a gentle throat, but a convulsing, crushing vortex of debris and ghostly, screaming faces. The beldam's enraged shrieks echoed behind her, a sound that would become a permanent resident in her nightmares. A single, scythe-like limb shot through the tunnel after her, sharp and determined. Coraline burst through the small door into her own world and, with all her remaining strength, slammed it shut, the heavy wood severing the pursuing limb with a sickening, final crunch. She had escaped, but the horror had followed her through. The severed hand, black and chitinous, did not die. It landed on the floorboards and immediately skittered to life, its sharp fingers scrabbling for purchase, a sentient piece of the beldam's malice. It darted toward Coraline, intent on retrieving the key she held and dragging her back. A new frantic chase began through the familiar halls of her own home. She ran for her life, the clicking, scratching sound of the disembodied hand echoing behind her. It was a relentless, vicious thing, a final spasm of the nightmare refusing to be banished. Her only hope was the one place dark and deep enough to contain such an evil, the old, forgotten well in the garden. She reached the well, its mouth covered by a heavy circular wooden lid. Fumbling with the key, she managed to pry it open, revealing a shaft of absolute silent darkness that seemed to fall away into the center of the earth. Luring the hand onto the lid, she used a final desperate burst of strength to tip it over. The hand, along with the key to the other world, tumbled into the blackness. For a moment, there was no sound. Then, from the deep, she heard a faint, frantic scratching against stone, a sound that grew fainter and fainter until it was gone. She sealed the well with its heavy stone cap, creating not a prison, but a grave for a thing that could not die. Her parents returned later that day, emerging from a deep fog on the road with no memory of their ordeal. They were unchanged, their attention still fixed on their work, their affection still a distant theoretical concept. Coraline had won. She had saved them, freed the ghost children, and locked the monster away. But as she sat in the quiet of her home, the victory tasted like ash in her mouth. She had not returned whole. The price for her parents' lives was her childhood, her innocence, her belief in a safe world. She was no longer a lonely little girl. She was a sentinel, a haunted warden standing guard over a terrible secret. The ghost children were free, but their final whispered thanks was laced with a chilling, permanent warning. The beldam was ancient, timeless, and impossibly patient. The well was not a prison that could hold her forever. It was merely a pause. Coraline had not killed the monster. She had only hidden it. She had won the battle, but the war would last the rest of her life. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the corner of her eye, every tap on a window pane would be a question, a potential threat. The horror was no longer behind a small door. It was inside her now, a permanent resident in her memory. Her victory was not an end to the story, but the beginning of a lifelong terrified vigil. She would forever be the girl who knew what truly lurked in the spaces between worlds, what hunger wore a mother's face and offered love as bait. She would watch the well and she would wait, knowing that deep in the cold, wet dark, a severed hand was patiently scratching at the stone, and an ancient evil was dreaming of the day the lock would rust, the wood would rot, and the door would once again swing open. Now you know the truth. It is not a story that ends with a triumphant hero. It is the story of a permanent scar, of a childhood sacrificed to keep a monster at bay for just a little while longer. The silence you hear is not peace. It is the sound of a little girl holding her breath, listening for the scratching to begin again. And she will listen forever.